The concurrent Battle of Meiktila and Battle of Mandalay were decisive engagements near the end of the Burma Campaign. Collectively, they are sometimes referred to as the Battle of Central Burma. Despite logistical difficulties, the Allies were able to deploy large armoured and mechanized forces in central Burma, and also possessed air supremacy. Most of the Japanese forces in Burma were destroyed during the battles, allowing the Allies to later recapture the capital, Rangoon, and reoccupy most of the country with little organized opposition. The situation in 1945. The Japanese situation in 1944. The Japanese had sustained several defeats in the mountainous frontier regions of Burma. In particular, at the Battle of Imphal and Battle of Kohima, the Japanese 15th Army had suffered disastrous losses, mainly resulting from disease and starvation. The heavy Japanese defeat prompted them to make sweeping changes among their commanders and senior staff officers in Burma. On 1 September 1944, Lieutenant General Hayataro Kimura was appointed commander of the Burma Area Army, succeeding Lieutenant General Masakazu Kawabe, whose health had broken down. At this stage of the war, the Japanese were in retreat on most fronts and were concentrating their resources for the defense of the homeland. Kimura had formerly been Vice Minister for War, and had held other posts with responsibility for mobilizing Japanese industry for the war effort. It was hoped that he could use the rice fields, factories and oil wells of Burma to make the Japanese forces there logistically self-sufficient. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka was appointed to be Kimura's chief of staff, with day-to-day responsibility for operations. He had formerly commanded the 18th Infantry Division in northern Burma, and had a reputation for inflexible determination. Japanese losses in Burma and India in 1944 had been catastrophic. They were made up with drafts of conscripts, many of whom were not of the best physical categories. Kimura's staff decreed that their divisions in Burma should have a strength of 10,000, but most divisions mustered barely half this reduced strength. Furthermore, they lacked anti-tank weapons. To face massed Allied armor, they would be forced to deploy their field artillery in the front line, which would affect their ability to give concentrated fire support to the infantry. Expedients such as lunge mines, or suicide attacks by men wearing explosive charges, were not effective if the enemy tanks were closely supported by infantry. Other losses handicapped the Japanese. Their 5th Air Division, deployed in Burma, had been reduced to only a few dozen aircraft to face 1,200 Allied aircraft. Their 14th Tank Regiment possessed only 20 tanks. Kimura accepted that his forces stood little chance against the numerically and materially superior Allies in open terrain. He therefore intended that while the 28th Army defended the coastal Arakan province, relying on the difficult terrain to slow the Allied advances, and the 33rd Army continued to fight rearguard actions against the American and Chinese forces which were trying to open a land route from India to China. The 15th Army would withdraw behind the Irrawaddy River. He hoped that the Allies would be overstretched trying to overcome this obstacle, perhaps to the point where the Japanese might even attempt a counter-offensive. The Allied situation. The Allied Southeast Asia Command had begun making plans to reconquer Burma as early as June 1944. Three main options were proposed. One was to reoccupy northern Burma only, to allow the Ledo Road to be completed, thus linking India and China by land. This was rejected, as it could use only a fraction of the available forces and fulfilled only an out-of-date strategic aim. A second option was to capture Rangoon, the capital and main seaport, by a seaborne invasion. This was also impractical, as it would require landing craft and other resources which would not be available until the end of the war in Europe. By default, the plan adopted was for an offensive into central Burma by the British 14th Army under Lieutenant General William Slim, to reconquer Burma from the north. The operation, originally codenamed Operation Capital, which was intended to capture Mandalay in central Burma, was renamed Operation Extended Capital to encompass a subsequent pursuit to Rangoon. In support of 14th Army's offensive, the Indian 15th Corps would advance in the coastal province of Arakan. The Corps was also ordered to seize or construct airfields on the coast and on islands just offshore, which could be supplied by sea and which would be used as bases from which aircraft would supply Slim's troops. The American-led Northern Combat Area Command, consisting mainly of Chinese troops, would continue its advance to link up with Chinese armies attacking from Yunnan province in southwest China, and thus completed the Ledo Road linking China and India. It was hoped that 15th Corps and the NCAC would distract as many Japanese forces as possible from the decisive front in central Burma. The chief problems which 14th Army would face were logistical. The advancing troops would need to be supplied over crude roads stretching for far greater distances than were ever encountered in Europe, although expedients such as locally constructed river transport and temporary all-weather coverings for roads were to be used. Transport aircraft were to be vital for supplying the forward units. Disaster threatened as early as the 16th of December 1944, when 75 American transport aircraft were abruptly transferred to China, where the Japanese Operation Ichigo was threatening American airfields. Although aircraft were hastily transferred from the Mediterranean theater to replace those dispatched to China, continuing threats to deprive 14th Army of the support of American transport aircraft were to be a constant concern for Slim during the forthcoming battles. The 14th Army was supported by 221 Group RAF, which operated B-25 Mitchell bombers, Hawker Hurricane and P-47 Thunderbolt fighters and long-range Bristol Bow fighter bombers. They could also call upon the B-24 Liberator heavy bombers of the Far Eastern Strategic Air Force. The most important aspect of air support was probably the Combat Cargo Task Force, which included both British and American squadrons of transport aircraft, in particular the ubiquitous C-47. 14th Army required 7,000 sorties by transport aircraft every day during the maximum intensity of the fighting. Most of Slim's divisions were on a mixed animal and mechanical transport establishment, which allowed them to operate in difficult terrain but restricted their tactical speed of movement to that of marching men or mules. In anticipation of fighting in the open country of central Burma, Slim reorganized two of his divisions as partly motorized infantry and partly air-portable infantry formations. At this stage of the war, few British infantry reinforcements were available. In spite of expedients such as drafting anti-aircraft gunners into infantry units, the strength of 14th Army's British formations and of the British units in its Indian formations was dropping, and Indian and Gurkha units were increasingly to bear the brunt of the actions which followed. Intelligence in the coming campaign, both the Allies and Japanese were to suffer from lack of intelligence about the enemy, and making correct assumptions about their opponent's intentions. The Allies had undisputed air superiority. In addition to the results of aerial reconnaissance, they also received reports from behind enemy lines from the reconnaissance units V-Force and Z-Force and the Resistance Liaison Organization Force 136. However, they lacked the detailed information available to commanders in Europe through ultra-radio intercepts, partly because Japanese radio security seems to have been good, and partly because Japanese linguists were lacking at all headquarters levels. On the other hand, the Japanese were almost blind. They had very few aircraft with which to fly air reconnaissance missions, and they would receive little information from the Burmese population, which was becoming disillusioned and restive under Japanese military control. Some formations had set up their own intelligence organizations. For example, 28th Army had created a branch of the Hikari Kikon, known as Hayat Tai, whose agents lived deep undercover in the frontier regions of Burma and in some of the remoter regions of southern Burma. However, these agents could not acquire or report information quickly enough to be tactically useful in a fast-moving mechanized battle. Opening movements. As the monsoon season ended in late 1944, the 14th Army had established 2 bridgeheads across the Chindwin River, using prefabricated Bailey bridges. Based on past Japanese actions, Slim assumed that the Japanese would fight in the Shwebo Plain, as far forward as possible between the Chindwin and Irrawaddy rivers. On 29 November, Indian 19th Division launched British IV Corps attack from the northern bridgeheads at Sitarung and Moor Lake, and on 4 December, Indian 20th Division under Indian 33rd Corps attacked out of the southern bridgehead at Kaluwa. Both divisions made rapid progress with little opposition. The 19th Division in particular, under Major General Pete Rees, was approaching the vital rail center of Indore, 80 miles east of Sitarung. After only 5 days, Slim realized at this point that his earlier assumption that the Japanese would fight forward of the Irrawaddy was incorrect. As only one of IV Corps divisions had so far been committed, he was able to make major changes to his original plan. The 19th Division was transferred to 33rd Corps, which was to continue to clear the Shwebo Plain and attack towards Mandalay. The remainder of 4th Corps, strengthened by 14th Army's reserve divisions, was switched from the Army's left flank to its right. Its task was now to advance down the Gangaff Valley west of the Chindwin, cross the Irrawaddy near Pakoku and seize the vital logistic and communication center of Meiktila by a rapid armor thrust. To persuade the Japanese that 4th Corps was still advancing on Mandalay, a dummy Corps HQ was set up near Sitarung. All radio traffic to 19th Division was relayed through this installation. To allow the main body of their divisions to retreat across the Irrawaddy, the Japanese had left rearguards in several towns in the Shwebo Plain. During January, the Indian 19th Division and British 2nd Division cleared Shwebo, while the Indian 20th Division had a hard battle to take Moniwa, a major river port on the east bank of the Chindwin. The Japanese rearguards were largely destroyed. The Japanese also retained a foothold in the Zagarang Hills, north of the Irrawaddy near Mandalay. Meanwhile, 4th Corps began its advance down the Gangaff Valley. To conceal the presence of heavy units of 4th Corps as long as possible, the advance of 7th Indian Infantry Division, where these 2 lightly equipped formations met Japanese resistance at Pauk. The town was heavily bombed by Allied aircraft to soften up the defenders. The route used by 4th Corps required upgrading in several places to allow heavy equipment to pass. At one point, the trail of vehicles stretched from Pauk to Kohima, 350 miles to the north by road, crossing the Irrawaddy. The 19th Indian Division had slipped units across narrow stretches of the Irrawaddy at Thabaikin on 14 January 1945 and Kyokmayong 20 miles north of Mandalay. The next day, they faced a stiff fight for some weeks against attempts by the reinforced Japanese 15th Division to counter-attack their bridgeheads. The crossings downstream, where the river was much wider, would require more preparation. The assault boats, ferries and other equipment for the task were in short supply in 14th Army, and much of this equipment was worn out, having already seen service in other theaters. Slim planned for 20th Division of 33rd Corps and 7th Division of 4th Corps to cross simultaneously on 13 February, so as to further mask his ultimate intentions. On 33 Corps front, 20th Division crossed 20 miles west of Mandalay. It successfully established small bridgeheads, but these were counter-attacked nightly for almost 2 weeks by the Japanese 31st Division. Orbiting patrols of fighter bombers knocked out several Japanese tanks and guns. Eventually 20th Division expanded its footholds into a single firmly held bridgehead. The area was defended by the Japanese 72nd Mixed Brigade and units of the 2nd Division of the Indian National Army, under Shah Nawaz Khan. The 214th Regiment of the Japanese 33rd Division held a bridgehead at Pakoku. The crossing by Indian 7th Division was made on a wide front. The 28th East African Brigade made a feint towards Yenang Yarung to distract the Japanese 72nd Brigade, while another brigade attacked Pakoku. However, both the main attack at Nyongu and a secondary crossing at Pagan were initially disastrous. Pagan and Nyongu were defended by 2 battalions of the INA's 4th Guerrilla Regiment, with one held in reserve. At Nyongu, 2 South Lancashire Regiment suffered heavy losses as their assault boats broke down under machine gun fire which swept the river. Eventually, support from tanks of the 116 Regiment Royal Armoured Corps firing across the river and massed artillery suppressed the INA machine gun positions, and allowed 15th Punjab Regiment to reinforce a company of the South Lancashire who had established a precarious foothold. The next day, the remaining defenders were sealed into a network of tunnels. At Pagan, 11th Sikh Regiment's crossing fell into disorder under machine gun fire from the INA's 9th Battalion, but a boat carrying a white flag was seen leaving Pagan. The defenders wished to surrender, and the Sikhs occupied Pagan without resistance. Slim noted in his memoirs that this action was the longest opposed river crossing attempted in any theatre of the Second World War, unknown to the Allies. Pagan was the boundary between the Japanese 15th and 28th Armies. This delayed the Japanese reaction to the crossing. Starting on the 17th of February, 255th Indian Tank Brigade and the motorized infantry brigades of 17th Division began crossing into 7th Division's bridgehead. To further distract Japanese attention from this area, the British 2nd Division began crossing the Irrawaddy only 10 miles west of Mandalay on the 23rd of February. This crossing also threatened to be a disaster due to leaky boats and faulty engines. But one brigade crossed successfully and the other brigades crossed into its bridgehead. Orders of battle at this point. The Japanese were hastily reinforcing their central front with units from the northern front and with reserve units from southern Burma.